Hey, this is Dr. J. Thanks for visiting the Veracity Hill channel. I hope you like my content, and if you do, be sure to subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any content coming forward. This is the second conversation with Paulogia, and we look at two critical issues for theism. First, we look at the problem of divine hiddenness, which is roughly speaking the idea that if God were to exist, wouldn't there be more evidence for his existence? And the second subject we look at is the role of the Spirit, the role of the Holy Spirit on Christian theism. But if you want to listen to that portion of the conversation, you've got to head on over to Paulogia's YouTube channel and watch the rest of our conversation there. So welcome, if you're coming from Paulogia's channel, welcome. This is part one. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and be sure to comment with your thoughts, criticisms, and suggestions for another conversation in the future. Thanks for watching. All right, Paul, it was a pleasure to see you again. I really enjoyed our conversation from about 6 or 7 months ago. And, I think when we had scheduled this a month ago, I realized, man, it had been a while, and I really wanted to do it again. And I think you enjoyed yourself as well the first time we chatted.
It was always a pleasure. It's great.
Yeah. It was, although we titled it about the obviousness of God, the history was I posted a video replying to Randall Rouser. And then you posted a reply to that, and so I said, hey, let's meet and chat. But while we titled it The Obviousness of God, we touched on so many different issues that after the recording, you called it like a meet and greet type of video, which is a great,
That's right.
a great description of the interview. If it's an interview, really more conversation, just chatting about our different perspectives on things. And I learned not just beliefs you hold, but some cool factoids about, like, you used to work for Lucasfilm and you met the man himself. I mean, that's super cool. And that you are doing the YouTubing full time. I'm a little jealous of that. So props to you on building up a following to be able to do that. And if I can ask, is that entirely from ad revenue from YouTube, or is that like through patrons, a combination of both?
Well, let he who preaches the gospel make their living from the gospel, as they say. But
Lucasfilm was good work for you, huh?
If we're going to talk YouTube, there's a whole that's a whole fun business side of things for me. I have an entrepreneurial spirit, and so a lot of that is, patrons is one aspect of it. You can't put all your eggs in one basket, though. Obviously, Ad revenue works for some platforms and not for others. YouTube, TikTok, not so much. Like, there's different things. This past year, I started my live channel, which is, perhaps people saw some of the stuff happening on the live channel, where you can get user engagement that way through super chats.
Yeah, people chip in like the super chat feature, right?
And also this last year, I started having sponsors. The interesting thing for me, the best sponsorships that have worked well for me is actually working with academic scholars like Dale Allison or Bart Ehrman and people like that, and working with them to promote their academic materials. It's weird how your audience kind of drives. I don't get to do like the Magic Spoon cereals, right? I have to do. I'm more into the academic stuff. So it's always challenging, and this whole content creator business. One of the things I noticed that I'm envious that a lot of other Christian channels get to do 501c3 type stuff. They get to be ministries, right? And they get to have some. When people donate to them, they can actually give them a tax receipt at the end of the year potentially, or some of their taxes are reduced, something like that. As a former Christian, I don't get those breaks anymore, so now I have to, do the dirty commerce, I guess. But
well, from a strictly business model, having a diverse source of revenue is healthy, because if you're exclusively on donors, I know there's some ministries where they're largely dependent on a big donor, and when that big donor goes out, you got to start making cuts, and that can hurt. So just from a business model perspective, it's good to have diverse revenue sources. So yeah, so I'm a little bit jealous that you could do it full time. So good for you. I'm hoping to be there maybe in a couple years. But I wear multiple hats, and I enjoy the work that I do. So yes, all right. Well, now we had briefly in our conversation several months ago, we had briefly looked at divine hiddenness. Again, we sort of hit the gamut of topics we discussed, but this was divine hiddenness. You said was, like you said, the problem of evil wasn't really an issue for you. Really, the problem of divine hiddenness is, for you, like, is it safe to say the largest issue or largest objection to Christian theism?
So, not to Christian theism, but to theism. I think Christian theism has its own whole separate layer, although divine hiddenness, I guess, really only works if you're positing a God who wants to have a relationship with me. Obviously, the divine hiddenness has nothing to say about a deistic God or a plurality of gods who don't care what I do or whether I know about them. So I guess you're probably right. It's fair to say a monotheistic relationship style God, divine hiddenness is my linchpin.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, in preparation for this conversation, I was doing some work this weekend, watching some interviews, and I read first two chapters, which sort of just introduced the subject on Michael Ray's book, The Hiddenness of God, published by Oxford University Press. The subject of hiddenness is not my expertise. My expertise is 5th century monks and their view of original sin. It's like super narrow. But it does get into discussions of salvation and sin, and some of which we might get into later on. But for you, hiddenness is the big issue. So I wanted to become a bit more conversant in the subject matter. But now, as you were saying before we started recording, there are a few different versions of the argument from the hiddenness of God. Why don't you walk us through, roughly speaking, before we get into because we could look at formal premises. Walk us through what is the problem of divine hiddenness.
Sure.
If that's the right way to even phrase that.
Sure. I guess I would give you the more Schellenberg has and others have phrased it in lots of different ways, and so I'll just give you the what I consider to be sort of a general case, and that is, if a God exists, then no non-resistant non-belief should exist. Non-resistant non-belief does exist, therefore God does not exist. So it's one of the rare arguments that actually ends with, therefore God doesn't exist. As you know, atheists or whatever side don't often put forth an argument to say no God exists. So this is one of those rare ones. Now, I'm going to say I don't adhere strictly to that form. I think that it has a little bit of holes, but I think, would you agree that is they all kind of boil down to what I just outlined there?
Yeah, that's maybe we could call a simplified form, and what you just told me there is a modus tollens logical deductive argument, so it's logically valid. What you just said is logically valid. The question is if the premises are true, and so and the premises, I think that's where there's going to be some pushback, like I said. So in logic, a deductive argument, the premises have to be true and the logic valid. That's what makes what's called a sound argument. You got to have both. Sometimes, especially Christians aren't versed in logic. Right. Please don't take me out of context.
No. There's my short. It's going on TikTok.
I mean, a lot of people, even non-Christians, aren't versed formally in logic all that much. But that's what it would take to make an argument sound. Right. And even then, some people, like for those that study the ontological argument, they argue that it is sound. I'm not saying everyone should, but some people argue it is sound, but it's just not a persuasive argument. So there's this whole concept of what does it take to even sort of convince someone of a truthful proposition. So at any rate, what you said, logically valid, and I think the question is sort of jumping into it, what does it look like to be in loving relationship? Now, the version of the argument that Michael Ray details as representing Schellenberg's argument is more detailed, and
Okay.
I think it was the form that I saw in the discussion with Justin Schieber and Gavin Ortland. This concept of that the loving God would always be seeking to be in a loving relationship, something like that. So, yeah, what does it mean to be loving? And maybe you could.
Well, and this is why I kind of
perspective.
clarified a little bit. I actually don't hold that it eliminates all gods. I feel like it only applies to a God who wants to have a relationship with me, and that a God also is therefore powerful enough to make it that what he wants would at least be potentially possible to happen, right? So a relationship, I think we would both agree, requires both parties. I think we're assuming, for the sake of the argument, that a relationship requires both parties to consent. That a God forcing me to be in a relationship with him isn't a relationship at all. I think we would generally agree to that. So, but I think that for me, also built into the argument is the notion that for me to consent to have a relationship, I need to intellectually assent that the other party exists. I can't enter a relationship with a party that I don't intellectually assent to. I think that's fair to say, right? So, go ahead.
Well, so just curious. Let's think about thought experiments. How about people who are schizophrenic? They think they are relating to people who don't actually exist. Now, maybe some atheists think this is kind of like what Christians do. They think they're in this relationship with something that doesn't exist, and they're kind of a little crazy for doing that, right?
Well, I don't like to use the word crazy because that was me. But you're actually describing, I now attribute all those feelings and all those prayers and all those conversations that I thought I was having with God to exactly that I was indeed talking to myself. But I don't feel like that was a mental illness in any sort of way.
Formal sense, yeah.
In any formal sense, because I think talking to oneself and having an inner monologue or an inner dialogue, as it were, I don't think ever ascends to something that's abnormal or that's not the way the brain normally operates and works.
But did you know some people don't have inner monologues?
But I like to take the word crazy off the table because I know enough people on my side like to say religion is a mental illness, and I just like to take that off the table. It's not.
Got it. Yeah.
So that's for my side, just not yours.
People can be genuinely mistaken. They don't have to be crazy. Yeah. Good. Okay, so the shortened version of the argument that you gave, and again, you've got some reservations yourself, but tell me about the concept of non-resistant. How do you phrase it? Basically,
non-resistant non-belief. So I think it's trivially true that there are non-believers in God. I think that's trivially true, right?
Yes.
One of us, at least on this call, doesn't believe in God. Possibly two. Just kidding. So what matters is, I think what's built into the qualifier of non-resistant is that the possible notion that a non-believer is resisting it in some way, as is described in Romans 1, for example, in unrighteousness, perhaps, or through psychological motivation, or through any number of psychological factors, that person is suppressing what they know to be true to their conscious mind. So this is classically seen, sometimes victims of a crime, right, will suppress that memory. And even though they ultimately do remember the bad thing that happened to them in their day-to-day life, they don't let it come to the forefront.
Right.
And so is it possible that every human who has ever existed believes in God that way? Is ultimately where this conversation ultimately goes, right? Every human acknowledges God in that way, but that we set up our own psychological barriers to not let that enter our consciousness, and or potentially even it does bleed over and we're just constantly tamping it down and, denying things. So, but the notion is, if there's a non-resistant non-believer, someone who is either neutral to the idea of God being a part of their life and or even desiring it to be part of their life, and this is a category I put myself in when I was deconverting, desperately wanting God to be real. Mm-hmm. Why would those such people not be able to intellectually assent or be convinced that a God exists? So, and then setting aside whether or not that type of a person can exist in practicality, if that person can exist theoretically at least, a non-resistant non-believer, totally open to the notion of God, but they just looking around at the evidence and they just don't see it or just are unconvinced. Can that be compatible with the notion that there is a God out there who wants to have a relationship with that person, and the only barrier between that relationship happening is some amount of further evidence?
Evidence, right. So for Schellenberg, and perhaps you, this is very much about belief. Belief that God exists.
Just the intellectual assent, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, we could sort of broaden the issue. So I'll go on the record and say that the problem of divine hiddenness can also be seen in the scriptures, in the Bible, but from a broader perspective. So Job, for example, the book of Job is about human suffering, and Job calls out for God. Where is God? He thinks God is being unfair to him. He says, if only there were a mediator from, basically because Job, and this is where a lot of Christians get this wrong. I think Job has bad theology, actually. The narrator's theology is what people should be learning from, because we've got the big picture perspective. But Job's theology leads him to accuse God of being unfair and unjust. But Job doesn't doubt God's existence. But God is distant and hidden. And so you do see one aspect of a broader view of divine hiddenness, but one that doesn't lead Job to doubt God's existence. Whereas for Schellenberg and perhaps you, it's very much an intellectual assent issue. So
right,
I think
that's a good clarification for sure. Yeah.
So we're looking at sort of a narrower view of the intellectual assent. Another thing I wanted to clarify is this. So, and having read Ray's first two chapters describing the problem, he quotes from Schellenberg, and I'd love it if you could help clarify for me exactly what Schellenberg means here by some of the concept of non-resistance. So, quoting from a 2015 book by Schellenberg, on the meaning of openness to relationship, Schellenberg has this to say: openness at a certain time means not through one's own actions or omissions, making it impossible for the other whom one loves to participate in personal relationship with one at that time should the other wish to do so. Alternatively, and applying this now to God, it means that it will be possible for creatures who haven't made it impossible themselves through their own God-obscuring resistance to the divine to participate in relationship with God. He continues on. So, help me out here. Does this, because you talked about the practical versus theoretical, is this basically saying that someone who was in a Christian context and leaves that context is not within the scope of the non-resistant non-believer? Because Schellenberg seems to be saying here, it means that it will be possible for creatures who haven't made it impossible themselves. So if someone leaves a Christian church, for example, even if justified to, like, say, because of abuse, like sexual abuse or something, totally justified in leaving the Christian, that particular Christian community, does that preclude? I'm just trying to get the
way I interpret that passage from Schellenberg, and always have, is that it's literally a la la la, I can't hear you situation that he's describing. He's saying, so anyone who doesn't want to be convinced of something won't be. I think you would agree about that, right?
Yeah.
Or no, I shouldn't say that, because there's always a level of evidence that will convince. For example, I think we've talked about this before. I had a cancer diagnosis. Didn't want to hear it, but there was sufficient evidence for me to overcome my lack of willingness. But Schellenberg there, I believe, is describing people. He says it's people who are making it impossible for the other person to interact. So I kind of see it as, if two people want to, for example, go on a blind date, they can only meet each other if both of them actually show up to the table.
Right.
That's the situation that I believe Schellenberg is describing there.
So
does that make sense to you? Like, is that a fair interpretation? Do you think?
a little bit, but maybe I've got further clarifying questions. So you talk about the person who's like, la 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 la, really ignoring the evidence. So that's called a resistant believer, right?
That's a resistant believer, resistant non-believer.
A resistant non-believer, and they say the resistant non-believer could say, "Hey, there's no evidence for God," and they're just like living in self-denial, right?
That's right.
In our previous discussion, we talked about sun deniers. We could find people who deny the existence of the sun, right? So there will be some people that almost for any issue you could find would be like that. So the question in view here is, are there non-resistant non-believers? So people who are genuinely open, they have, they could have lived through a Christian upbringing, for example, and still come to the position, there's no evidence for God. Is that's the type of person that's in view here?
Yeah, and I hesitate again to have this no evidence for God, because that's a very
insufficient.
bold.
Sorry, insufficient.
So
evidence,
insufficient evidence for God is a better way to phrase it. But if with that qualifier, I would agree.
Okay, yeah, and that's just sort of me seeking to understand the lay of the land. Yeah, it'd be interesting if we did like a roundtable discussion with some philosophers, like if we brought Michael Ray and some others on, just to see if we're understanding the issue. Sometimes these philosophical issues.
And what I'm the expert on is why it's convincing to me, as opposed to the general case.
Yes. In the interview, you said, and how much you want to disclose, is up to you. But you said it's a very personal issue for you. Is this pertaining to the cancer diagnosis?
It is not in any way. No. Okay. I deconverted very shortly before that, and it certainly played a role in how my life fell afterwards. But no, unfortunately, I think you would agree. Unfortunately, there were a number of Christians in my life who said, "Aha, see, this is God gonna show you."
Oh no! Did you really get that?
A lot, yeah.
So. Let me apologize. I am.
Yeah.
I think it really sucks when Christians say that sort of stuff, and that's really unfortunate. So I'm sorry you had to be on the receiving end of comments like that.
Yeah. But so I understand the notion that perhaps the question about the timing, I think, is a valid one. I think that you make a valid. It actually goes to was I potentially a resistant? If I wanted to treat this academically, was Paulogia a resistant non-believer or not a resistant non-believer? That absolutely
we all have biases,
is a factor.
and sometimes
So
we don't.
I try
we don't
to
see
do my
things
best.
We should, yeah.
I try to do my best, Mike Lacona, removal of bias.
Horizons, Mike calls them.
Horizons.
We have horizons,
right, yeah.
and we can't see beyond our own horizons, and so there's just some stuff outside of our view.
So I'm always happy to entertain those kind of questions because I think they're worth exploring. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, and again, you say this is very personal for you. It was before, and you don't have to share whatever you don't want to share. No problem there. But this is before the cancer diagnosis. Mm-hmm. So, was there something in your life? Was it just in our previous talk, you'd mentioned you grew up kind of young Earth creationism and you were exploring evolution. And was that sort of the issue that brought up divine hiddenness for you, or was it something else?
No, there was a number of dominoes. So if we were to do my deconversion story, the dominoes were young Earth creationism, biblical inerrancy, biblical reliability, and then it was my then struggle with, okay, I can't, the Bible to me doesn't hold any authority anymore, so what can I salvage of this relationship with God? Can I find a God outside of the Bible? And in that, so that's when divine hiddenness kind of was that last domino, because it was, outside of the Bible, I couldn't, there was no evident God to me any longer. So it was the last domino. And so that is, of course, what makes it most personal, because it was the final prayer when I was like, okay, God, this is it, right? This is one last time, even though I've uttered it since, but that one last time was incredibly heartbreaking for me. This is how I feel like I did all the soul searching, soul in quotes, that I needed to do to identify myself as non-resistant non-believer, because I desperately wanted to hold on to this. Like, there was just, everything in my life was going to be worse the minute after I let it go. So, so for me, that's how I could tell. And I don't want to initially steer the conversation necessarily, but I feel like divine hiddenness is one of those arguments that a Christian or a theist will never understand why it's a good argument, because God is not hidden to them. So then it's just kind of like, well, how can you not see it? It's kind of like, so how is that possibly compelling? And on the other side, I could never convince anyone else. I couldn't convince my partner. I couldn't convince anyone that I'm non-resistant. That's just one of those things that only I can know if there's a non-resistant non-believer. I can't know if there's one down the street. I can't sense anyone's thoughts. But the only thing I can be sure of in the world, even more sure than the existence of the world, is the content of my own thoughts, right? The content of my own thoughts. I can't lie to myself about the content of my thoughts. So, then I can be personally assured that I'm a non-resistant non-believer if I'm willing to look at the horizons, as we talked about, and explore them as far as I can. Because if my resistance is subconscious, is that really me resisting? At some point, God has to overcome some of those barriers for me. Right.
So
if it's, anyway, that was this tangent.
No, it's great to get that background and backdrop for your journey, and also for better understanding about what non-resistance looks like. So I know some Christians have made an attempt, especially in Reform circles, to say every non-believer is resisting. And we had briefly talked about Romans 1, which I think can be interpreted in a general sense. But so that's one tactic, one attempt. For me, I would say, looking at the shortened version of the argument, what is the causal relationship between the antecedent and the consequent, or the first part of the proposition and the second part? So for me, as I understand the shortened version you gave and the longer version I've read elsewhere, I think that it's not logically incompatible to think that there is a loving God who does desire a relationship with people, and yet there are non-resistant non-believers. So maybe God has sufficient reasons for creating a world in such a way that there are a small amount of non-resistant non-believers, just percentage-wise. I mean, atheists make up some say as big as 10%, maybe less than that, because how you count the nuns, I think, is a part of that conversation. So now, again, I know you are looking at this with regard to monotheism. My interests chiefly pertain to Christian theism.
And I'm happy. I'm happy for the remainder of the conversation stay in the Christian world. That's fine.
Yeah. So that's really can the Christian God be redeemed from the charge of hiddenness? Now, well, so, and again, as I said earlier, I was going to say,
Go ahead.
the scripture does talk about God being hidden. And there are multiple times in the Old Testament, through the prophets, book of Job, and even in Hebrews 6, there's warning passages about, what does it look like for someone who, once was a partaker of the Holy Spirit and has, basically left the faith, forsaken the faith. So I see that as another form of divine.
Yeah, impossible for those ones who've been enlightened to turn away. That's the scariest verses for me, Matt. Those were scary ones, yeah.
Yeah, well, but isn't that like hiddenness, right? Doesn't that get on the concept of hiddenness, that when they turn away, they can't go back?
That was
there's distance.
It's possible for those, but they've once been enlightened, right?
Right.
Possible for those who've once been enlightened. I feel like those people are the ones that are just straight up. God's not hidden at that point. That's like I'm turning my back on the God that I know exists.
I see. Okay. So again, I would say that's hidden from the broad experiential perspective, but when we look at this narrowly, those people don't fit the non-resistant non-believer category because they are a resistant non-believer.
And that's, I think that would fall with anyone who is like, I am turning away because I'm mad at God. God didn't perform in the way I wanted. Like, though, I feel like those people do have an intellectual assent that there is a God, right? Yeah. But you're just choosing to say, you are not moral in the way I want, or you betrayed me in some way. Like, I would classify those people as having intellectual assent. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Well, there's also another verse in the New Testament about how even the demons believe
exactly.
Jesus is Lord. So there's there's propositional truth.
No, but that's the argument that people on my side of this hold to, is like, God could make all of us have intellectual assent. Like, that is the lowest possible bar in the world. It does not interfere with my free will, because demons have free will and they have intellectual assent. They get to have it. Why don't I get to have it? It can't be a free will reason, because lots of people have intellectual assent and turn away.
But the other side of the coin says, look, even the demons believe and are not followers of the way.
Yeah.
Well, so it's in that regard. The other side of the coin is that it's not about intellectual belief. It's not about. Let me clarify. It's not about
intellectual. But that's a prerequisite.
It's not about well, right. Yes, it would be a prerequisite.
You agreed to that. You agreed to that up front.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we did touch on that in our first discussion. Yeah. So it is a prerequisite to believe God exists in order to follow God. Yeah. Yeah. And that's reminding me of our discussion I want to get into on the Holy Spirit, but maybe not quite yet. So getting back to the argument, divine hiddenness, for me, I view it as a non sequitur, which means, it does not follow. Because I think that the Christian God, at least, it is a loving God. Now, I'm trying not to have cognitive dissonance, because I know people are going to disagree with me on that. The God of the Old Testament sort of line.
Sure. Yeah.
That God is loving. He does desire relationship with all people, 1 Timothy 2, and yet there are non-resistant non-believers. So I don't see what's logically incompatible or what's contradictory about those two notions. So
what's contradictory is that if there is a God who says that in 1 Timothy that he wants that relationship with everyone, that he has not provided the prerequisite for that for everyone.
Right.
Because
so this is right.
He could, right? He could provide that prerequisite to anyone.
Yes, and I think he has. So then the question is, well, why are there some people who say he hasn't done that prerequisite?
Well,
right?
we're still wrestling with that first one, right? You're talking about, is can a loving God not provide the prerequisite? And you wanted to say the loving God doesn't need to provide the prerequisite.
No, I'm saying the loving God does provide the prerequisite.
Okay, so then you actually agree with the first premise.
That if a loving God
exists, and classify loving in this vague sense of wanting to have a relationship, I think, for the sake of this. If a loving God exists, then there are no non-resistant non-believers.
Well, so I don't think that follows. Let me give an example. Let me give an analogy.
Please.
Now, analogies can be strong or weak, so you might think it's weak. And I'm happy to receive constructive feedback. I'm an open book, and I keep no secrets, and I can take criticism. So think of a romantic couple, and they get in a fight. Now, again, I know where you're going to say it's weak because they both believe each other exists. But the principle I want to demonstrate is that sometimes in a loving relationship, someone, either one party or both parties, needs space, right? They ask for space. They get in a fight. Hey, I need some space. I need some time to think, right? We should all be aware. We see it in the Hollywood movies. We see it on TV. Maybe in our own lives, we've had seasons like that where we just need space. So that space creates relational distance. And even the relational distance creates a gap in the experience of the other person. And so the other person might even be seen as hidden because they're not seen, right? Out of sight, out of mind. So in this analogy of a human couple, we could see how sometimes the loving thing to do is to give someone space. What would you think of that analogy with regard to the concepts of loving and relational distance? So are there some cases where it is loving to give people space?
Absolutely it is. I think that is, I think that's trivially true. But that said, you correctly, it's not analogous in the sense that
we're talking about God here, right?
We're talking about intellectual assent. So when I was a younger man, I had a crush on Jennifer Connelly, the actress. But Jennifer Connelly married to Paul Bettany. So one might say, well, you know what? It wouldn't be good to break up her relationship. I'm giving Jennifer Connelly the space she needs to work through what she's doing right now.
She doesn't even know you exist.
Jennifer Connelly is not aware that I exist, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah.
So, am I really giving Jennifer space, or is there?
Well, but you know what you could do. So let's assume she's not married, right? Let's assume that you're both young and single.
Some other person. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, but you could do certain things to provide hints or clues of your existence. You might send Jennifer gifts. You might mow her lawn.
Right.
And so she doesn't see you. She doesn't know who you are, but she knows someone has mowed the lawn for her. Right? So she can sort of make an inference based on some states of affairs. I would call them evidence.
But only to the point where she will not have made a choice. She cannot choose to be in a relationship or not to be in a relationship with me. So let's say I went and secretly mowed her lawn, and Jennifer was like, well, okay, she can't actually say, I'm going to choose to be in a relationship with this unknown person who mowed my lawn. That's not a choice she could make. There needs to actually be, and you agreed to this, there needs to be intellectual assent that the other agent in the relationship exists.
Now, suppose that you thought, well, if she were to meet you at this stage in your life, maybe like you're a personal maybe a financial mess. Maybe she needs someone well off financially.
Sure,
And you wanted to wait. You wanted to wait a few years till you built up the lawn mowing business to introduce yourself. So maybe you thought you had reason to think that she wasn't ready yet to meet you, right? If you want to be in a relationship with her. So you wanted to do a few more things in order to secure your best chance at success. So you decided to wait and put off an introduction. Is it still compatible that you are showing love to her, you're providing evidence that someone is there caring for her, but yet the time is not yet ready for you to meet?
So
Is
you
that-
have pointed out, we've pointed out I think the greatest weakness in the divine hiddenness is time t, the variable time.
Okay.
Because one could always put the word yet on the end of each of those, I think.
Yeah.
And and be cogent to say, Paul, God hasn't revealed himself yet, but he will. And that is an argument that's only defeated when I die. Because God knows when I'm going to die. No, God knows when I'm going to die.
Yep.
And so if he didn't, if that intellectual ascent never happened before I died, then the chance is gone, right? Well, no, I think you think that there's potentially of afterlife reconciliation.
Yes, we talked about this. Yeah, this is reminding me.
Yes, that's right.
So I brought up the postmortem opportunities. Yeah.
And actually, then I'm excited, as I described last time. Cool. Then actually nothing we do on earth, whether or not I ascend to choose to be in a relationship with God here on earth, ultimately doesn't matter that much. So then great. Then we're just chatting.
Yeah. I mean, I would disagree with that in the sense that
you want me to have a theodicy or something.
Well, no, that there's value to this life in the here and now. So a lot of Christians think they're just passing through earth, stay out of hell free card type of thing. And I don't think that's Jesus's message in the Gospels, in the Gospel according to the four evangelists.
Well, let me temper that then to say that it's a temporal disadvantage, but in terms of in light of infinity, in light of eternity, it's not. It's a bearable cost.
It's a bearable cost. That
for me to have, it's ultimately like I may, if God gives me, if I die and then God gives me another chance, I might regret that my decades on earth were spent poorly.
Yeah.
But I would still ultimately, have an opportunity to be in His glory.
Yep.
So, but that still actually goes to the idea that at that point, then I would have my intellectual ascent, and then I can make the choice that I never would have had a chance on earth. Why didn't I have a chance on earth with that intellectual ascent to make my choice? You're saying God's saying I guess the flaw in your analogy depends on who's. Am I God or is Jennifer Connelly God in this scenario? Because you were almost saying God was getting himself ready with his lawn mowing business.
So that is what I'm implying with the analogy that your role as the lawnmower is like God who prepares the ground. I mean, we could look, for example, even at some of the parables of Jesus about the sower. Who sows seed.
Yeah, but it sounds like you're saying God needs to get a little bit more wealthy for me to give him a chance.
No, not financially speaking, but maybe certain states of affairs do need to align or occur in order for some end result to come about.
But God's unchanging, right? So God's character isn't being honed. It's the human in this side who isn't ready.
So in this sense, the human relation is the Jennifer Connelly. So God is preparing the human for a meeting, and sometimes when you want to prepare a meeting, you send an invite, you send an email, maybe a phone call, right? So you do some things first. I know some people be like, God's manipulating humans, but not quite. I mean. God is fostering relationships, I think. And I think that's an active work of God. I am not a Calvinist. So, Calvinists hold to the doctrine of predestination, really double predestination. And so that there are some people God has specifically made just to damn them to hell. I don't hold to that view. So I think God is actively interested in cultivating relationships with people. So the question is, well, what about some people that don't perceive the evidence?
To rewind this back, we added the word yet there. I do think the word yet complicates it with a time factor t. And so in order to talk about the argument without weighing in the time factor, I guess we could just move this to the point, the last point in time T where a person can make a decision, be
Yep.
that pre-death or post-death. I think you would agree that if one doesn't have intellectual assent before they have their opportunity to make a choice, then it doesn't
Yep.
really matter.
Yeah, so thinking about the formal premise of the argument, if we were to insert or propose this new variable of postmortem opportunity, that would, correct me if I'm wrong, but that would formally defeat the premise, right? I mean, it would show that it's logically compatible for God to be loving, and yet there are, at least in this life, some, very few, non-resistant non-believers.
Right,
And I say few as like a relative to the population.
Then this is where it becomes more of I feel like divine hiddenness isn't work great as an argument to convince someone else that God doesn't exist. It's more that, again, it's that personal thing, because only a person themselves can identify this non-resistant non-belief status.
But
at that point,
so my question is about the
way
premise,
you're
though.
describing it. But the way you're describing it, you're right. But then I would be like, well, now I don't care, because now I'm just waiting for time for me for the time variable T final, T prime, or whatever we're calling it. I'm now in limbo and just waiting for that time to happen. And I shouldn't live my life any differently one way or the other, right? Because I can't assume that it's going to happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, you might start exploring. You might take a personal journey, like Dr. Stephen Strange, goes on the exploration for finding meaning. He starts hiking. Did you see Dr. Strange, the Marvel, the first one?
Indeed, more times than is good to count.
You'd like to admit. Yeah. So, like in the plot, he breaks his hand, right? He's a doctor, and so he has this existential crisis because he can't do what he was amazing at doing. So he seeks all the answers, goes to all the gurus, yada yada, and he finds his way in the Himalayas. So he goes on a existential journey. So maybe you might consider that if the first premise were defeated, formally speaking, but yet, as you say, it's still a very personal thing, it just places you in limbo, then maybe you might, or one might change their behavior, right? They might seek out the spiritual meaning if it's to be found there. So it sort of goes from like...
Yeah, and I guess for me personally, I feel like I did take that journey, and the Ancient One never hit me in the chest and knocked me out of my body, which is the evidence that was needed, right?
Not yet, Paul.
not yet. But so I think, again, with if we're willing to play with that time thing and say not yet, then yes, what my responsibility probably is to remain non-resistant.
Yeah, but
doesn't
that take, if there is some openness potentially, doesn't that move someone from being an atheist to an agnostic?
You're now talking about labels I also don't care about.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm not much of a label guy.
The only label I care about is theist and non-theist.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Because I definitely feel like I'm atheistic towards some. Again, we were going to talk about Christianity, but I'm definitely atheistic towards some proposals for God, and more agnostic about others. And I think Christianity is one of those ones that I'm still open to. So
yeah. Interesting. Okay, so getting back to the formal argument, so the postmortem variable, if you will, that would serve as a formal defeater to the first premise.
I think so. But it removes the stakes, shall we say?
Yeah. Yeah, and yet we're still lingering in the sense that there are people who don't perceive evidence for God. They don't perceive God, and that is a real phenomenon. And how do we make sense of that? That's to be explored beyond even our time here, I think.
Even perhaps.